Welcome to everybody, and we've got others joining us. I'm going to just say a few words to sort of kick us off. So the idea of this World Intellectual Forum, as you know, is to bring people together. Here's David, who's our first speaker coming. Welcome, David. Greetings.
Galileo.
Yeah, just in time because it's our. So I'm doing just a brief introduction to everyone. David Lorimer will be our first speaker, who's joining us from the south of France, not too far from me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a very brief introduction to the sort of meeting, and then we'll get on with the agenda. So for those of you that aren't familiar, my work over many years has been about peace. The primary focus of the World Intellectual Forum is on peace, conflict resolution, and healing the splits between nations and between religions. And I think intellectuals have an important role to play in this. If you look at history, I've studied history for years. Intellectuals, often work behind the scenes. We're not necessarily known in our epoch, but we're the movers and shakers behind events. And the premise of this work is that by coming together from different backgrounds, religions, cultures, and nations, we can sketch out a path for humanity to tread. Because humanity at the moment is floundering. There's a lot of wars, unresolved wars. United Nations structure can't really cope with them. It's not sophisticated enough. It's working on what they call a Newtonian billiard ball model of international relations. And one of our colleagues on the international board, Professor Glenn Miller, thinks that we have to outgrow that model of international relations. So I set up the Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy at the University of London in the early 1990s, 91. And having become coordinator of Philosophers for Peace. And I've been watching in horror as these, countries fell apart in the Balkans. The Soviet Union collapsed with conflicts, the Afghan war, the Middle East, the unresolved Israel-Palestine conflict. So all this is, I feel like a duty as an intellectual and philosopher coordinating Philosophers of Peace. We have to do something about this situation. What can we do is get our thinking right. Fichte, a great intellectual, said, thinking is also an activity. We have to get our thinking right and be impeccable. And that's why when I was invited to help launch the World Intellectual Forum, I took on that duty. And we have members from India, from all over the world. One or two are joining us a bit late. One of them's been taken off to a meeting with an Indian minister who's helping us. So just to conclude my opening remarks, I want to say my contribution intellectually, what am I doing here, is as a historian. In my doctoral thesis, I studied what I called and christened transpersonal history. I think historians are partly to blame for the mess we're in, because they came up with a materialist interpretation of history in the 19th century. Marx quintessentialized that, dialectical historicism was progress. People thought that if you base history on materialist paradigm, you can get progress. Now, that somehow didn't sit well with human nature. It seems like a great idea, but we've seen chaos and mayhem. So we have to rethink historical paradigms. And I've argued that we should factor in the transpersonal side of human nature, but also study its history, like be scientific about spirituality.
That's fine.
Okay, so not taking on board at face value, the claims of the different religions, but subjecting them to scientific analysis psychologically using transpersonal history. Anyway, I'll say a few more words about that at the end in my closing remarks. First, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, David Lorimer, who's joining us from the south of France. David, can you introduce yourself? Say a few words. You'll have to unmute your microphone first.
Yeah, and I'll just put my...
Where are you joining us from, David?
Well, I live in the southwest of France, the area associated with the Cathars. And so I'm between Limoux and Foix.
Oh, right, very much in Cathar country.
Exactly. So I'm about half an hour from Montségur,
Yeah.
which is one of the sort of spiritual center of Catharism, if you like.
I know it well, it's a beautiful part of the world. Limoux, I know it's
Yes. Well, my work is I've got two strands of my work, I suppose. One is the Scientific and Medical Network, which I've been associated with since 1986. So I'm the editor of the journal, which is now called Paradigm Explorer, and I produced over 100 issues of that. And as part of it, I review about 150 books a year. And so I've got a very wide range of reference and reading. And so about half the actual journal is book reviews, either longer ones or shorter ones. And then following the pandemic, we have gone into overdrive in producing a program of webinars. And we're now doing one a week. In fact, next week we've got two. And they range across a really wide spectrum of topics and themes. So that last week we had Steve Taylor talking about how oneness leads to goodness. And then this week we had a healing session from a Danish musician. And then next week we've got neural correlates of mystical and near-death experiences. Followed by Can We Be Happier? Ethics, Evidence and Politics with Lord Richard Layard, towards the end of the week. And we've got a big program going forward. One aspect of this, which I'd like to mention, is my work with what we call the Galileo Commission. So the Galileo Commission was set up 3 years ago. And the reason we're using Galileo, which you might think is rather confusing in terms of the science of consciousness, is that the telescope metaphor, that the regressive thinkers of the day refused to look through Galileo's telescope. And likewise, materialist philosophers and psychologists, neuroscientists, refused to look at the evidence that their model might be incomplete, and that we need an overhaul of the materialistic worldview to stress the fundamental nature of consciousness. That's a whole other topic, I think, but I wanted to mention it. So if you go to galileocommission.org, then you can see the three types or versions of the report. We have a layman's version, a summary version, and then the full report for academics with a lot of references. And it argues that the idea that brain produces consciousness is actually a philosophical assumption. And we need to re-examine these philosophical assumptions instead of taking them for granted and confusing science and ideology. So that's another part of my work. The third thing I'd like to mention is in terms of education. I used to be a teacher of philosophy and modern languages at Winchester College a long time ago. That was one of the main public/private schools in the UK, founded in 1382. And since then, a lot of my work, in fact, all my work virtually, has been with different educational charities. So I created a charity called Character Scotland in 2009. And with that, I've developed what I call an inspiring purpose program, which is a template that young people go through in order to become more self-aware and increase their self-knowledge, to find sources of inspiration, and then to define their aspirations for their own life. And that's reached 350,000 young people over the last 15 years or so. And this year we're working with about 72 schools. And this is a slightly smaller scale than usual, partly because of the current circumstances. And so I really have a passion for education in the widest sense. And then last thing to mention is that, well, you'll hear about my work with Peter Dunoff in the presentation I'm going to make.
Yeah.
And
Can I just interrupt briefly, David? Because
yes.
I just want to tell people that David's popped back up on my radar. I watched a brilliant interview of him with the Bat Gap, Buddha at the Gas Pump series, where Rick Archer interviews like contemporary sages around the planet. If you don't know that series, Rick Archer's doing an amazing job from his base in the States, interviewing people. And he had David on for 2 hours talking about, or just mind-blowing, you know, the role of consciousness research, near-death experience, all kinds of things. And I've known David for like, I don't know, 30 years. We met in the 80s at the salon in London of an amazing woman called Baroness Edme de Pauli, who was like a one-woman powerhouse of
Yes, that's true.
alternative visionary thinking. And she used to get all the philosophers from around the world to come and visit and do a talk. She was way ahead of her time. And I think that's where we first met, David, but we've been aware of each other's work all this time. So I think what's exciting is that because you're very much working at the cutting edge of new thinking, if you want to do your presentation, have you got a PowerPoint for us?
I have actually.
Okay,
yes,
well, let's go to that.
Well, what I've done is
technically
you need to make, I need to be a co-host.
Right, so let me just sort that out. Where do I go to do that? Nicola, do you know how to do this? You'll have to unmute. Share screen, I think it's down there, isn't it? Okay, multiple participants.
I should be able to, let me see. I'll try and, it looks like I can.
Yeah, try and share your screen. And then you can talk as you share. Yeah,
there we go.
Can you get my
Right.
So that's it. I'll just put this into full screen mode. And let's play from current slide. Here we go. I'm just having another.
It's a great title, Love, Wisdom, Truth.
Well, I'm actually just going to record this on my own computer.
Sure.
Wait a minute.
I'm recording already, so I'll send you the link, David. Don't worry.
Yes, no, I just like to record this on my own computer as well. I just need to, sorry, I just need to escape to be able to do that because I can't get the right, I don't get the bottom part of it. Well, that's interesting.
I'm not sure you can record from the same.
Yes, I can actually.
You know how? Okay.
Start recording. I think I can probably do that now.
Okay.
Yeah, that's recording. Right. Okay. Yes, right. So love, wisdom, truth, and technocracy. I've actually created this PowerPoint for the current purposes. And so it's a new presentation incorporating some of what I've done before, but really up to date in terms of my thinking. So start here with T.S. Eliot's Rock Chorus from 1934. He talks about the endless cycle of idea and action. Endless invention, endless experiment brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness. Knowledge of speech, but not of silence. Knowledge of words and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. All our ignorance brings us nearer to death. But nearness to death, no nearer to God. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Extraordinarily prescient, and I think. and he also in his 4 quartets had the wonderful line, distracted from distraction by distraction. And if he'd known what was coming, he would have realized how prophetic these words were. So a few slides and quotes on progress. This is from Aldous Huxley, Ends and Means, 1941. In the world in which we find ourselves, technological advance is rapid. But without progress in charity, technological advance is useless. Indeed, it is worse than useless. Technological progress has merely provided us with a more efficient means of going backwards. And you'll know a lot of people have been rereading Brave New World and Brave New World Revisited in 1984 in the light of current events. Then here's Arnold Toynbee, the historian, 1975, talking about what I regard as the wisdom gap. Technology gives us material power. The greater our material power, the greater our need for the spiritual insight and virtue to use power for good and not for evil. The morality gap means that since we first became human, we've never been adequate spiritually for handling our material power. Today, it is greater than ever. I mean, 1975, so that's a long time ago, nearly 50 years ago. And it's still, in fact, it's truer today probably than when he wrote it just at the end of his life. And then another view from Civilization and Ethics from Dr. Albert Schweitzer. 3 kinds of progress are significant for culture: progress in knowledge and technology, progress in the socialization of humanity, and progress in spirituality. The last is the most important. Technical progress, extension of knowledge, does indeed represent progress, but not in fundamentals. And the essential thing is that we become more finely and deeply human. So progress is largely equated with technical progress in kind of modern, popular parlance. But actually it's this inner progress, this spiritual progress, the transpersonal progress, if you like, which is key. I'd like now to move on to a book by Jennifer Gidley called The Future. This is in the Oxford University Press series, which is called the Very Short Introductions. And she's an Australian futurist, and she contrasts these 2 visions of the future: human-centered transhumanism, which I think is actually not that good a term in view of the fact that transhumanism is used in a very different sense by most people, or technotopic posthumanism, the post-human. And this is the vision, for instance, of Martin Rees, who was president of the Royal Society, and whose position was demolished in the last book by Mary Midgley called What is Philosophy For? So this is looking at the mechanistic mindset and its extension. And this is what was already mentioned or referred to by Thomas in his introduction. So L'Homme Machine came out in 1749 by Julien de la Métrie. And the machine or mechanistic metaphor has taken over our metaphorical landscape, if you like, and it's still very, very dominant and damaging in terms of its limitations. So this implies control, instrumental values, utility, efficiency, speed. So these are the values associated with this kind of power and technological advance. So thinking is just processing, data processing in terms of algorithms, data mining, big data, and so on. And what it leads to, if you translate this into social terms, is technocracy, which is the rule of technology. And I've been realizing as a result of a book I've been reading recently, as you can see here, Technocracy, The Hard Road to World Order by Patrick Wood, that this is the direction of travel, that we're moving towards the domination of our lives by technology, which will also involve a huge degree of surveillance. We're already surveilled by our phones, and in case you didn't realize that. So Alexa is listening to what you say, if you've got Alexa switched on in your household, and you'll find yourself served up with what you've been talking about as an advert the following day. And if you look at the new book by Jeremy Nadler, sort of book of essays on the struggle for a human future, you'll find a very good analysis of the direction of travel and where we are at the moment. So China has 600 million facial recognition cameras, and an experiment which was done and referred to in this book recently was you've got a city called Guiyang with 3.5 million inhabitants and facial recognition cameras all over the city. So it was an experiment done where a journalist went outside in a random place in the city, and it took the police 7 minutes to track him down through facial recognition cameras and data processing. So that gives you an idea of the extent of control that's possible, and which will become more and more possible. It's something we could go into later. And then the metaphor used here is enhancement. And so people who don't get chips put in themselves and all sorts of new programming and so on will be referred to as the unenhanced. And I would be proud to call myself unenhanced in that sense. And this involves the fourth industrial revolution, and a lot of what's been talked about, not the green aspect, but the technological aspect at this week's Great Reset World Economic Forum. And this is all in terms of AI, automation, robotics, genetics, nanotechnology, with sci-fi imagination as a driver, going towards the idea of an Übermensch, the Superman, and implying the rollout of not just 5G, but 6G and 7G, in which we haven't looked into the health aspects of, the Internet of Things and the Internet of the body. And so that eventually we will have devices where our vital functions and thoughts are being monitored and fed into the cloud. And this is, I think, is where we really need to stand up as intellectuals and say this far but no further, and get a public debate on this. And so Colin Tudge, in his new book, The Great Rethink, which I highly recommend, he says where humans are going about making themselves redundant, which is an extraordinary thing if you think about it. We're actually designing a future in which we don't need to be taking part. And so we really need to rethink what relationship between work and dignity and so on. There's some fundamental rethinking to go on here. And I'm not saying that we want to carry on doing the kind of work that we've traditionally been doing, but we do need to think about the nature of work. Then immortality in this view is a kind of disembodied upload. And the body, indeed, if you look at the work of Robert Ramanujan, the body is kind of bypassed with this technological imperative. And we are embodied beings, we're emotional beings, we're sexual beings. And so if you compare this disembodied upload with spiritual immortality of the soul, and the soul brings in heart, feeling, empathy, and love. It's a context which is relational and participatory. And I just mentioned in this respect the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who's a very old friend of mine, in The Master and His Emissary. And the fact that we, at the moment, are dominated by left hemisphere technological separational thinking. And we need to rebalance the hemispheres so as to recognize the right hemisphere as actually the master hemisphere of creative apprehension and synthesis. And obviously they need to work together. And so do we want an impersonal or a transpersonal future? A clever one or a wise one? Do we want Ray Kurzweil or Peter Dunoff? That's the question to ask. I'm just inserting here a slide on what I call freedom of attention, because we live in an attention economy, and the publicity budgets of Facebook and Google depend directly on the amount of attention they can prove that we spend on their platforms, which then monetizes them and gives them enormous power, as we've seen, also to censor non-mainstream views. And I found this quote from Rousseau very interesting. The most complete authority is the one that penetrates the inner man and influences his will as much as his actions. This is the direction of technocracy, in my view. And the appropriate region of human liberty, this is from On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, 1860s, comprises first the inward domain of consciousness, liberty of thought and feeling. And I think this is a vital point to remember. And so the quality, I would argue, of our inner state or environment is our real quality of life. Our quality of life is the quality of our consciousness. Now, here's a view from Anne Baring from her great book, The Dream of the Cosmos. And this is what I call an inside-out future, which is the greater reset rather than the great reset. The greater reset is a regenerative reset. It's a decentralized reset. It's a community reset. It's a human reset, and not a technotopic reset. And you can go to thegreaterreset.org and have a look at what they've been doing this week. So the direction here is, if you use the work of Owen Barfield, this would be from original participation to final participation. This is an evolutionary direction. Recovering the connection to the soul or the anima mundi, the resurgence of the feminine, psychohistorical literacy, understanding the role of the shadow, which is absolutely critical these days because the polarization means that the shadow is polarized and projected onto what you don't agree with. And you can see this particularly with Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab. And although they don't seem to be aware of their own shadows, but that's the work that we all need to do. And this implies an alchemical transformation of consciousness and the experience of a conscious universe pulsing with love and light. And this is a crucial distinction to make, because the deepest human experiences, in my view, are experiences of being one with love and light. They're not experiences of being disembodied and detached and not inherent part of the universe. I'm just showing you this diagram here because it was formulated by Professor Brian Goodwin and his students at Schumacher College on the 12th of September 2001. And it's provided an enormously fruitful tool for the work of the International Futures Forum, which is where it comes from. And these love and fear loops. And what you can see from the last few months is we've been firmly maintained in the fear loop, with more control, generating fear, generating distance from each other. I mean, there may well be, and people have different views about whether this is justified, but I'm just pointing out that the fear and control and authoritarianism go together. And Goebbels said, if you make people afraid, they'll do anything. FDR said, the only thing to fear is fear itself. So understanding fear and going beyond it is really critical, and moving into this love loop, as we say. Now, the rest of the talk, I'm going to drill down into fundamentals in terms of our values and vision, using my work on Peter Dunoff, whose spiritual name was Beonsa Duno. So if you're looking at on the internet, you can Google under either of these, Beonsa Duno or Peter Dunoff. And that's a picture of him middle age, and another picture at a slightly later stage. So he lived 80 years in Bulgaria, and in my view was one of the the greatest spiritual teachers of the last several hundred years. And his work is not well enough known, despite my own efforts. My book, Prophet for Our Times, was republished with a foreword by Wayne Dyer in 2015, and is coming out in French this year. So here's a picture of a walk I had on the 1st of August, or 2nd of August, I think, 2017, in the Urdini Lakes in the Rila Mountains in Bulgaria, which is, as it were, my spiritual home, and where Peter Dunoff and his followers had camps every year from 1929 to 1939, and even a little bit of camping in 42, 43 during the war. It was very, very difficult. And then in the mountains, and this mountain you can see behind is called Haramiata, we dance the panurhythmy every day. And the panurhythmy, you have musicians in the center, and then everybody is walking and doing the gestures, sacred dance, anti-clockwise around them in a circle. And you can see Peter Dunoff in the middle there doing the gesture for liberation. And obviously I can't go into this, but I think the point about panurhythmy is that it stands for human beings working together and rhythmically working together and moving together through a series of gestures which include giving, reconciliation, joy of the earth, happiness, and many others. There are 28, and then there's 28 in the first part, then there's the sunbeams in the second part, and the pentagram in the third part. This is very, very powerful. And the principles of the pentagram, there are 5 which make up the principles of the pentagram: love, wisdom, truth, justice, and virtue. So love corresponds to life and the heart, bringing peace and joy. Wisdom, bringing light to the mind. Truth is the combination of love and wisdom, and this is represented sometimes in the paneurythmy movements, bringing freedom and integrity and corresponding with the will. Then you have justice or equity, and virtue or goodness. And I sum this up in what I call the 4 L's: love, life, light, liberty. Now we come to the evolution of consciousness, which is more like a background, if you like, to what we're talking about. And he explains that there's a process overall of involution and evolution, of moving away from the center and back towards the center. And this is symbolized particularly in the sunbeams part of the paneurythmy. And it also corresponds to the what I call the sort of Gnostic myth, or the cosmic game of life, which consists of density and fineness, forgetting and remembering, ignorance and gnosis. I have a separate presentation on this. So you go from, this is also similar to Barfield, primitive collective consciousness through to, individual, when I need to go back. How do I go to the previous one? Just like
it's at
this.
the bottom, I think.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to want me to do that.
We'll carry on with
wait
this.
A minute, there's another one here. Oh, no, it doesn't want. Okay. You're moving from the individual, then to collective consciousness, and then to cosmic consciousness, and then to divine consciousness. And the divine consciousness implies a felt understanding and identification with the whole, that leads to an understanding that we're all inherent parts of that whole, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment. And therefore, we apply the golden rule. And this is the basis of my work on life review and near-death experience. And so 4 degrees of human culture, coming on to this slide, these 4 degrees, I've put them in bold, of violence, law, justice, and love. So violence, and you can see that actually all of these are present in our current situation. Violence implies force, domination, and power. Law, threat and control from the outside and engendering fear. And that's what's been happening to us over the last few months. Justice, which is universal and excludes individual privilege. And love as life for the whole, which in Dunov's understanding, the 3rd and 4th level of love are love as a force in the mind and a principle in the spirit. By love as a force in the mind, he means embodying love in action, like Gandhi and Schweitzer and Mother Teresa. And as a principle in the spirit, what he means is the ultimate harmonization of opposites. And this, I think, is part of what we're trying to do at the moment as a culture, is harmonizing and going beyond opposites. Because if we don't go beyond polarization and opposites, we're in deep trouble, or we remain in deep trouble, as you can see from the current position in the US. Gandhi, this is a very powerful quote, and one which is similar to Peter Dunov. Love is basically not an emotional, but an ontological power, the essence of life, the dynamic union of the separated. And that's how I understand love, love as a force, as a principle. And this is what we need to understand as a culture, in to understand this deeper aspect of love. Now we have life for the whole. And this morning I've been rereading this book called La Sagesse. So I'm reading it in French. And so a lot of these quotes are from that book. So his premise is one of nature, living an intelligent nature, that all beings form a whole as branches and leaves of the great cosmic tree, of the cosmic organism. And this is the basis of equity, which is the fourth principle. And it's not uniformity, it's unity in diversity. That's absolutely critical. And because the Chinese technocracy, in my view, strives for uniformity, whereas life itself is unity in diversity. So life is one, mind is one, love is one. The abundance in the world, he writes, comes from love, which brings all good. Wisdom distributes the good that love brings, and truth gives the power to act. And then he says that the supreme goal of human life is that people should be free and to serve love, wisdom, and truth. So these principles, these are the central principles of Dunoff's system, and everything, he always came back to these, this trinity, if you like, of love, wisdom, and truth. And for me, I've been thinking about this recently. Truth also corresponds to trust and transparency, and that's what we now need to recover. So ethics and the law, he says there are three kinds of life: life for oneself, life for society, and life for the sublime principle. And so you can see that one of these is serving yourself, one is serving society, and one is serving the divine, or serving God, or the sublime principle, whatever word you like to use. So there's a corresponding law of the part of oneself, and this is individualism, selfishness, me first, law of the jungle. Then you've got the law of the majority, of the neighbor, the ethics of the neighbor, and that's as far as a materialistic society can go. It can't go beyond the collective, beyond society, the good of society. And the good of society is an outer good rather than inner good, even though there is an evolution towards new measures of well-being beyond GNP. This is another big topic. So the law of the whole is the law of the divine. So as I say, you can either serve yourself, serve society, or serve the divine. So the new culture, in his view, is a culture of love. Current culture, he says, is one of intelligence, while the new culture will be based on love. The new culture can arrive in two ways, and I put Chris Beisch in brackets here because his new book on LSD and the cosmic mind projects evolution forwards, and you can see that exactly this situation is described by Peter Dunoff in the 1940s, that there are two ways that new culture can arrive. One is through the awakening of human consciousness. There's an inner transformation of a new wave. And the second is the path of suffering through catastrophic breakdown. Now, I was on a call this week with Paul Ehrlich and Bill Rees and Nate Hagans and others from the Omega Institute and Michael Lerner, where they were looking not only at the kind of environmental trajectory, but also the human response to it, both individually and collectively. And so it's incredibly difficult without a really fundamental change of values to see how we're going to steer ourselves through this polycrisis, as they call it. And he then says that these new people will think of the good of their neighbors as their own good. And now is the time, he writes, for the strong to manifest love, to give all the warmth and light of their love. And he writes, the appearance of Christ on earth is nothing other than the manifestation of divine love within the hearts and minds of men and women. And this is something, if you think about it, you know, our own personal fulfillment is in terms of these 4 L's: more life, more love, more liberty, more light, in terms of more wisdom. And these are the quintessential aspirations, I think, of the human being. And then here's a very interesting message that he sent to the conference, the Treaty of Versailles conference in Paris, while it was going on. And it could have come from Christ, as you see. Those who love their enemies are people of the new future culture. And if those who are attending the conference in Versailles love their enemies, a real peace can be established between the peoples. If they do not love their enemies and peace is re-established, it will be temporary. Real peace is one that brings in the future culture of work, life, and love. If the peace which contemporary people expect rests on the law of Moses, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the future will prove what kind of peace this is and what culture it will bring. Well, that was more than 100 years ago, and we are in a more dangerous situation, also with respect to nuclear weapons. And then coming to the end now, how to act, and this is these are his images for this, work as the application of love. And so the new culture is working for love and service, which, if you think about it, all mothers already do, and fathers as well, if they're on the ball. People sacrifice themselves for their loved ones, and they're already working for love. Many of us, I work for love myself, and many of us are already doing this. So he suggests that we need to act like light. It gives you its life. Act like the apple tree. It gives itself to all. Act like the source. It distributes itself to all. And be grateful for everything in order to receive everything. So in other words, take part in the give and take of life, because life is exchange of energy. And this is a poem that I wrote in 2018, which I call Essence. It's not how it would be set out on the page, because it would otherwise have been too small for you to read. To see and to be seen, to hear and to be heard, to open and to be opened, to be touched and to touched, to be loved and to love. This is the fruit of light distilled. The woven texture, the feel, the taste, the priceless currency of life together. There you are.
Well, David, thank you so much for your visionary presentation. And you've given us lots of food for thought. As always with PowerPoint, like a fractal. There's
Thomas, we've lost your voice. Can you check your microphone, please?
Yeah. I can't hear him either.
Oh, sorry. Apologies.
Okay. It looks like I haven't been able to record that.
Okay.
So
we have a recording of the whole thing, David.
Yes,
so
you'll have to send that to me, and I'll just extract the part.
I'd just like to thank you again for your brilliant presentation. It was very moving, and it sets a very good tone for our work as the World Intellectual Forum. We're trying to come up with new paradigms. I met one of the disciples of Ben Sedunov, Ivanov, who came to London in the 80s and who inspired me. I met him. And so I think we're all on the same team doing this work. Okay, now we have a talk presentation from our friend in
I just
Wales.
wanted to acknowledge David for the incredible distillation of spiritual wisdom and light through that presentation. It's like all the world's deepest insight condensed and just very direct and clear. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I wish there was time to go in and discuss the whole thing more, but we'll have some discussion at the very end. We have a few other speakers I want to make sure get a slot. And we're being joined, as I said, by Peter Marshall from Wales, who's written some amazing studies of intellectual history. And I think what he will say will complement what you've been saying, David, from a slightly different perspective. So, Peter, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me right?
Yes, we can. So go for it. Yeah.
Okay, well, I've been asked by you in particular to talk about the importance of intellectuals in history and society, and also about a little bit about my own work and how I see out the future developing for the all beings. And as I agree with our last speaker, it's very important that we consider the whole being of a human, and also I would say of all sentient beings. anyway, as an intellectual, I try and keep it short. As an intellectual, obviously, one's a person involved with careful thinking and with critical inquiry, and someone who thinks, who sees things as they are, but also points out how things could be. And so that he's involved with analyzing the existing order, if you like, but also saying how the future could be better. So he, in a way, ideally, he engages in deep thinking and high feeling. So also, I think as a so-called intellectual, I've always considered myself an outsider on the edge of society, and that therefore influenced by it, of course, and influencing it in some ways. But I'm ready to comment on it, and I as an outsider, I have a special, I think intellectuals in general have a special view on things because they don't have to, they are independent of all power of church and state and also of authority in general. That's very important, I think, to be independent and to be able to stand outside things. But unfortunately, we see many potential intellectuals reduced to just being apologists for either for governments or for corporations or simply for advertising, in advertising and public relations. And that's a complete waste of, in my view, of their potential of their potential usefulness. So by being independent, one doesn't necessarily have to be totally objective. And even if that were possible, so we always see the world from some sort of corner of consciousness in our room. But we can make a public stand, I think, on contemporary issues and events, and be independent of any power. But I would also emphasize the importance of praxis, which I think Marx called it. But in fact, I'm not necessarily following Marx, but I do think that we should try and, in modern parlance, walk our talk, practice what I preach, practice what we preach. So in some way, just theory on its own is a sort of meaningless in a way. It can be useful, but of course, but it can be just empty thinking, and also activity can be meaningless if it's not combined with theory. So I think there should be a combination of thinking and of action. And for this reason, I've actually tried to be involved with various actions and movements, as well as writing about them. And I've co-written a pamphlet, for instance, against nuclear war. I went on peace marches and on protests, and so on. And also, I tried to put in my own practical ecological principles by planting an orchard and by working a vegetable patch. And also as a vegetarian most of my life and increasingly vegan, I always say that's something where one can change one's personal life at the same time working for the greater good and the well-being of all sentient beings. It does actually release less, as you probably know. It releases less land for trees and for plants, less damage to the atmosphere. And I would ask, what right do human beings have to all the grain on the earth? It should be shared out. And I think that one's own life should try and reflect one's own thinking as far as possible. So one should act for oneself and for others, and think and act for each other. And in the past, we've obviously seen very great intellectuals who have spoken up on events of their day, like Erasmus in Holland and Voltaire in France, and during the last century, there's Gandhi in India, and also in the last century, there's Jean-Paul Sartre, who is then defined an intellectual who is someone who meddles in what does not concern him. People around need to get involved. And also we had, I mean, Bertrand Russell in Britain. Many of these people have died now. Who was very much working for peace and the wider good. Also Edward Said in the Middle East, and now we have Noam Chomsky in the USA, but is while critical of the intellectual apologists, at the same time is one in for capitalism and establishment, but nevertheless points out, you know, the dangers of social policy. So these are mainly of my generation, people of great intellectuals in the past, but I'm sure there's very important ones today as well for the younger people. But I just can't think how we can remain silent in this terrible inequality of the world, you know, where 2 billion people have no access to clean water or enough to eat. 2 billion, you know, out of 7 billion, and they suffer. And we while in the West we suffer from obesity, and throw half our food away, and yet, and 1% of the world's population owns 99% of the wealth. So this is unbelievable if you consider it. And even you know, if you suffer from COVID, that it's far worse in a poor society where there's no national health and no vaccinations available. So I believe that intellectuals should be against those that have an active mind, I suppose. They should be against those who damage the planet and the environment, against those who wage war and who work for the apologists, who are just simply apologists for those in power and in authority. But rather, I think we should argue and fight for greater equality and social justice. Not only, for, as I say, not only for humans, but for all sentient beings. As William Blake pointed out, I've done a book on him as well, once, that everything that lives is holy. And that's the case whether it's trees in the Amazon or rhinos in East Africa, and even the permafrost, you know, in Siberia. These are all a part of wider ecosystems. So, as you pointed out earlier, my own background is in the history of ideas, something called intellectual history. And so I went to Sussex University, where I did an MA and a PhD. But since then, I've written 17 books, and I made a radio series and a television series about my different views, and that my voyage around Ireland and around Africa. And they've been just more than just, you know, enjoyable travel series. But because I have written 17 books. I appear as a philosopher, historian, travel writer, and poet. And when I first started out, I did a study of William Godwin, who I did my PhD on him actually, and he was probably the first great thinker of anarchism. But I also went on to look at more closely, and went there to examples of independent socialism, so outside the Soviet bloc. So I went to Tanzania, particularly in developing countries. I went to Tanzania and to Cuba. So in Tanzania, of course, the founder, the first president, a chap called Julius Nyerere, tried to practice African socialism, but the trouble was he forced people into villages, and because he thought they would provide more services, which they certainly were able to, but it meant this they couldn't go to their own chambers, their own fields to work, because they were miles away. And I think you have to actually not just have a powerful leader, but be involved with the people themselves who are directly involved. And then, of course, very briefly in Cuba, that we saw the revolution occurring there with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. But why they improved society in many ways and stood up against the West, that there's certainly greater social equality there, and gender and racial equality. But at the same time, there's been a cost in freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, even the ability to practice different lifestyle experiments, and of course there's only one party state and one newspaper. So this I'm afraid is a shame. But I want to try and look at these independent examples of socialism outside the independent bloc. But I came to the conclusion that with everything being forced and with authoritarian regimes, it doesn't work for the people. I went on to write a long book called Demanding Impossible, as we mentioned, about the ideas, movements of anarchism around the world and in history. And that certainly came to confirm my ideas as a libertarian socialist or a anarchist. But I did also write at the same time, more or less, but published later, a book called Nature's Web, which was exploring a history of ecological thinking in the great traditions around the world, philosophies and religions. And both concerns came together in another book I wrote called Riding the Wind, Liberation Ecology for Our Era. And it was a statement of my mature thinking on these matters. And so this idea of some sort of libertarian socialism and ecological insight and awareness is important, I think, are not necessarily exposed separately. They're part of a very my worldview, and because we can't be free if even other beings are enslaved, let alone other peoples. And then I went on to write a book called Europe's Lost Civilization, which was exploring the mysteries of the megaliths, who were built in Britain from about 6,000 years ago, or Europe, in fact, about Europe. And I went around by boat looking at these various megalithic sites, and came to the conclusion that the ancient people who had found these megaliths had a very clear understanding of the planets. They built monuments in stone which were raised to the sky. They had a very complex religion and a rich social life. They were nowhere near like the so-called primitive savages, as they made out to be still today. If you also look at Göbekli Tepe, which I visited in Turkey, quite close to the Syrian border in eastern Turkey, that there's a fabulous monument there, which say most historians and archaeologists think may have been built by hunter-gatherers about 9,000 years before Christ, before our common era. And that's quite extraordinary to think that people at those days, in that period, were thinking and worshipping in ways which we've lost in some way. And so I try to bring that back at the same time. Not after that book, I also studied around the world when I went to India and many parts of Europe, India and China and Egypt, alchemy and astrology. And these were very obviously important, but they still exist in many parts of the world. They were very important in the West for the early science and medicine. And I think the idea, someone mentioned earlier about the animum mundi, I think David did, but important that that the actual world is living. And within the Hermetic tradition, there's a very strong belief that, you know, as the microcosm is, so is the macrocosm, as above, so below. And they also had a very strong, coupled with their science, they had a very strong religious sense or spiritual sense. And I think that's, although it laid the foundations of the Western modern medicine and science, it's also at the same time we can gather a lot from that tradition to try to bring together the split is this very serious split between religion and science. So anyway, I'll shoot at these works. I did a study of a man called Rudolf II. He was on the face of it against my principles or interests, but he was a man who was based in Prague in the late 16th and early 17th century. He in fact was a Holy Roman Emperor at the time, and the head of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is very powerful in Europe. And he gathered, but at the same time, he was a great intellectual in the sense he gathered together in his court people, artists like Archimoldo and other day, and the English philosopher John Dee, the Tycho Brahe, which I think was a Danish astrologist, and the German mathematician Johannes Kepler, who, and then amongst them they laid the foundation of modern science, but they were very much part of the transition, and they're involved with alchemy and astrology. And what is important to me is that how he lost his empire, but at the same time he encouraged free inquiry, and much to the horror of the Catholic Church in Rome, that he pushed the boundaries of permissible thought, and as a result, he led to his personal downfall. But it was a great example of the widening of freedom and thinking. So we have got to a stage in the modern Western society where economic capitalism and liberal democracy is a norm, and it's tried to be exported as much as possible. But in fact, this linking so-called liberal representative democracy with capitalism means that, as everyone knows, I'm sure, that we have this mass consumerism, but also we have this narcissistic individualism, and which concerns, you know, things for me, as long as I'm right, Jack, they will take the hindmost attitude, and that's so prevalent. It's unbelievable. There's no real drive for the interest of the common good or the general well-being, or any spiritual dimension. So people, but if you look at the earlier leaders, earlier spiritual thinkers, the wise old men, if you like, and women, that some which David talked about earlier, or have more contemporary proponents, we find that we should be loving our neighbor as much as ourselves, and not just simply thinking of self-love. And in many ways, authoritarian regimes are even worse, because they did not deny basic human rights to a form of democracy, and the rights of thinking and assembly and as writing. And these, of course, as an intellectual and as intellectuals around the world, which World Forum is obviously involved with, that to stand up and make a point about this and say, you know, we shouldn't accept this. So finally, I would say that in opposition to many of these developments, I've become a libertarian socialist. I think I believe like Noam Chomsky, but what I understand is the freedom of one is inevitably involved with the freedom of all, And same with this. I mean, the classic example is a contemporary example is COVID. You know, see, one nation cannot be safe if all aren't safe. And so the freedom of one is inevitably involves the freedom of all. And I work to end authority and hierarchy and domination in society and in our daily dealings, also with nature. And that's I think very important. Very important. We try and end social inequality and get greater social justice, but we have to extend that to nature and other sentient beings. That it's not just humans have been particularly independent intellectuals, always put humanity first, not really thought about other species. So you know, I would just finally emphasize how we are all parts of nature and not separate. Unlike many of the traditions and religions I studied and philosophies in nature's web, we are all part of nature, and it's only by saving nature we can save ourselves. It's so obvious that, but it seems that many people don't understand it.
So Peter,
that's the end of it.
yeah, let me just thank you for your very good remarks. I think I'd just like to just to supplement what you said, that many people in the intellectual sphere since Buddha's time or Mahavira or Pythagoras have extended their concern to all sentient beings. So I don't think we need to, the trouble is intellectuals have been working in pockets. So there's pockets of light, you know, now's the time for us all to come together and stop playing my Confucianism is better than your Buddhism, or my, you know, Christianity is better than yours. There's a paradox also in what you were saying, which just one little comment before our next speaker. I have the same problem, which is I'm by instinct a libertarian anarchist, you know, Kingdom of God, Tolstoy, it's within you. But on the other hand, I love libraries and Senate House and universities. So I love the fact that the Vatican has a fantastic library, and that, you know, so I love institutions and I like order, and I love Rudolph II, the fact that an emperor can organize this stuff, or Elizabeth I could have someone like Dee. So I want the best of both worlds. I want the fruits of the state, its ability to organize universities, higher education, science, Newtonian physics, etc. But I also want decentralized wisdom, everyone to be the center of the kingdom of God. So it's a paradox. And somehow we intellectuals have to bridge this, you know.
Yes.
And it's the old war between the Cathars and the church, you know, the Catholic Church. So look,